Right, yes. Welcome everyone to our unusual ROUGOL Christmas meeting, and particularly welcome to all those around the world, since this must be one of our most international meetings. We're now covering most of the planet. And as we were just saying in the chat, covering most of the age range as well, which is quite good. So I'm not going to say much. We've got a few meetings possibly lined up for next year, but they're not exactly all confirmed yet. So we'll keep an eye on the website. So if you're all ready, Rob, I'll hand over to you and let you take it away.
Thank you. Well, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for inviting me. I feel quite honoured. It's a little bit of an out-of-body experience to be doing this, but here we are. I'll jump straight into it. I was being asked before we started about that image. That will be at least it's intended at this stage to be the cover design for my biography of Acorn and all things associated with Acorn. My friend Eddie Peterson took this photograph in October this year, just north of Hay in central New South Wales. You can see the photograph is unretouched, other than the fact that I took what's supposed to be passing as a hotel, the One Tree, in fact, out of the picture. I chose that particular image when I was trying to come up with a title for this book. Voices from a Future Past I was sort of channeling the Moody Blues, Days of Future Past, their album, and they stole the title from one of the comics from the 20s or 30s. So we're getting good value out of it. We're still recycling it. The idea of the looking into the stars, of course, is that if you're looking into the past, and in some ways, I guess we think we're looking into the future as well. So I thought it was a good metaphor for it. Let me start with this. Does anyone want to show how literary they are by telling me the quote, "The small boys came early to the hanging"? Can anyone tell me what that was from?
It's a bit Mark Twainish, but...
No, it's from The Pillars of the Earth. It was the first chapter and the opening line of the last chapter when kings were being beheaded. I thought that when I started preparing this presentation, I was thinking about the books that had influenced me, and certainly that was one of the great English works describing technology. It was building cathedrals, but technology nevertheless. This one's a bit more current, the topic, all the way to the horizon in the last light. The sea was just degrees of grey, rolling and frothy on the surface. Does anyone recognise that? The people who shared the journey remembered west the following winter. Describing the nasty northeaster over dinner, the captain remarked, "That fellow West is a good man in the storm." Now, there's got to be someone amongst you that would recognise those lines. It's probably the most the book that has had more influence on me than any in my life. No takers? It's the opening lines from The Soul of a New Machine, the creation of the Data General MV8000 Eclipse. And West was the guy who led that team. And I mentioned these here. I was just thinking when I started preparing this, and I've been thinking about it, in fact, over the last year, what was influencing me in the approach I was taking in my writing. You probably don't recognise that. To reach 4A Market Hill, Cambridge in 1981, you passed through an unimpressive entrance at 4 Market Hill beside the Eastern Electricity Showroom. Located on the eastern side of the market square, the end of the passageway was so poorly lit, even the graffiti was difficult to read. That's the opening lines from my book. So you probably haven't read it yet.
I've been through that door.
Yes, it's a memorable. You can't forget it. So, in preparing this, I looked back through the questions that people have been asking me in emails and in text messages, and one of the most common was, what made you start writing a biography and about Acorn? And I'd been talking to Herman last year about writing a biography about him, and he, after a lot of discussion with Herman and Pamela, his wife, they decided that they didn't want a biography. Well, they told me that they were going to write their own, but I can say with absolute confidence that Herman will never write one. That's been challenging to deal with him. But Doug Pauling, who I don't know whether Doug's logged in or not to this session, Doug was the managing director originally of Barson, New Zealand, and then when Acorn took over Barson, Doug continued running New Zealand and eventually ran the whole business. And I couldn't have attempted this project without him. I've badgered him almost every day. So that was the first trigger. And the second trigger was Chris Jarrett, who asked me to speak in early June at the Econet weekend. And that set off a whole bunch of other things, and people have been very generous with their time. So yeah, that's where it all started. And what did it involve? Equal parts research, cat herding, and writing and editing. A lot of cat herding. The research has been really interesting. I don't know of anyone, including Steve Ferber, Sophie Wilson, Doug, well, pretty well everyone in the book when I've given them chapters to read, has come back and said, oh, there's so much here I didn't know. It's a very much a stovepiped experience working on a project like the BBC Micro, and you tend to know your own little bit, but you don't. And if you did know some of the other material, after 40 odd years, you've probably forgotten it. Reconstructing the events, it really was like a episode of Murder, She Wrote. I finished up, I was fortunate to make contact with Richard Russell, who gave me access to 1,000 pages of correspondence from the BBC, of which I took copies and digitised. So it's now searchable text, about 600 odd pages. Amazing material, an extraordinary collection. And Richard has an extraordinary mind. He forgets nothing, and his eye for detail is extraordinary. I couldn't have done it without him. 11 hours, 12 to 18 hours a day, 11 months rather, and 6 to 7 days a week. Just ask my wife. She loves how much time I've put into this project. So I was trying to work out what that translates to a normal job. I've spent most of my career jumping between engineering and writing, and it's probably the biggest writing project I've undertaken. Not so much the writing as the researching. The motivation, well, it was an amazing time from the 60s when the story begins through the 70s with Callaghan being pushed out and replaced by Margaret Thatcher. And I must say I feel more positive towards the Conservative government of that era now, that having seen more of what their influences were. I'm sure there'd be a lot of people who would disagree with me, but the computer literacy project with the BBC and everything that went with it wouldn't have happened without that government. And it was an extraordinary time for the lives of you folk over there. Acorn is prime movers. So the prime movers, I mean Herman, Christopher Curry, Chris Turner, Andy Hopper, Sophie Wilson, Steve Ferber. Those stories have been told and retold many, many times. I saw the opportunity to dig deeper into all the other people that were contributing. I'd spent time at Cherry Hinton and Market Hill and out at French's Mill and down in London with John Cole at the BBC television studios. And I knew that there was a much bigger story there than the very one-dimensional yarn that gets presented and regurgitated. And as I say, so much has been published has simply been wrong. My personal favourite is you go to Wikipedia. I don't know if anyone's corrected it yet, the Acorn System 75. I don't know whether you've ever noticed the Acorn System 75. It apparently was the first computer Acorn ever produced. In fact, it was the System 1, which sold for £75. But it is, if you Google Acorn System 75, you'll see it gets mentioned in quite a few places, and that's just one of thousands of errors. My approach, a snapshot of the events through the stories of the people who made it happen. It took a while for me to get people comfortable with the idea. Most of the chapters, not all of them, but most of them are written in first person. So you've got David Allen talking about how he got into it and what he talks about the projects and the programs, but a lot of his own experience as well. Christopher Curry, he has 2 chapters. There would have been one on Herman and one on Christopher, but Herman was determined not to participate in a first-person narrative, and that's what the book is. So the material is there, but it's either written in third person in other places, but there is no named chapter any longer. By the way, if anyone wants to ask a question anytime, I meant to say earlier, stop me or put it into the side questions, and I'm happy to answer them at any point. Doug Pauling, I mentioned earlier. Brian Coburn, known to a number of you as Bruce, because you folk struggle with having too many Brians in the same office. I understand that. I used to be Robert, and then I became Bob, and then I was running a company in Melbourne, and they couldn't cope with having 2 Bobs, and so I ended up becoming Rob. So I do understand some folks struggle with duplications of name. It's probably a fifth normal optimization of the data that goes on in their heads. David Allen, I've picked these names out because these people actually I've missed Carl Della from that list. He probably deserves to be there as well. He does deserve to be there. Steve Ferber, Chris Turner, Christopher Curry, and Sophie were all a great help in getting this off the ground. And I was talking about the approach. After 40 years, Brian and others are still able to help me get in contact with the other people. Google was useful for in a number of cases. There were some people who've just fallen off the net and just don't seem to be able to reach. Glenn Phillips, I was keen to talk to. Glenn and I built the first 10 using boards from Cleartone at the end of 1981, which I believe the only one remaining is the one that we have out here in the Melbourne Museum, which will be shared next year at National Museum of Computing. You've got it on loan for 6 months, I believe. The BBC experience. The BBC wasn't really interested until I spoke to the Director General, and Tim was going to do the forward. I was hoping he was for the book. And then he had to hurl himself on his sword after some run-in with the President of the United States. So I'm blaming Donald Trump for everything in the world, including the fact that the BBC wasn't as helpful as I would have liked. David Allen, so really has been a joy to work with. Fantastic guy. I knew him. I've met him a couple of times when I was going to the BBC, but he didn't remember me, but that's probably fortunate. Richard Russell, the patron saint of BBC Basic, he kept Basic alive and developed it. Sophie has made a comment to me about what an extraordinary thing he has done in developing it and keeping it going. I think the BBC Basic is one of those very much underappreciated developments of that era that I think should still be in schools. Bugger this object-oriented programming stuff. I'd much prefer writing in BBC Basic. Actually, while I'm talking about BBC people, if I may, I'd also like to mention someone who's no longer with us. On the day that I finished the book, John Radcliffe passed away. So John Radcliffe was David Allen's boss, and he has a chapter. He was feisty till the end. He wasn't crazy about my including a report he wrote in 1981, but he said, well, if you must have it in there, put it in the back. So that's what I've done. So wherever John is, I've only spoken to him a few times, and recently twice on the phone. A lovely gentleman, a finer human being you couldn't hope to meet, and his family must be really struggling with his passing. And despite my background, I hadn't appreciated how important the Computer Literacy Project had been to the UK and the rest of the world. If it hadn't been for that project, the BBC Micro wouldn't have happened. The ARM chip wouldn't have happened. So many things that we take for granted, they probably would have happened at some time in some way, but probably in a different way. The impact that project had on the world, I don't want to speculate, but it really has been massive. And it became a larger part of the story than I had originally imagined. That there would have been a small entry there, but in fact, you've got several chapters. David Allen talks about it. There's the hunt for what became the BBC microcomputer. There was a relationship between BBC with Sinclair on one side and Acorn on the other. I have a piece in my book that begins, will no one rid me of this troublesome priest, which begins talking about the relationship between the BBC and Clive Sinclair. I enjoyed writing that. So my approach was to build on each contributor's perspective. That became it wasn't where I started, but it became the focus. So I just found that each person had their own way of looking at it, and I wanted them each to have their own moment of heroism in the story, rather than all being the usual, Herman did this. And mind you, Herman's name appears more than double anyone else in the book, because he had such a phenomenal impact. There's obviously Christopher Curry, Steve, and Sophie are right up there, and Chris Turner, and then there's some others. But still, you've got brilliant narratives. Arthur Norman, I've got a quote in there about, I've made the observation to Arthur that there were more brain surgeons in the world than there were writers of compilers, and he went off and checked the numbers and came back and confirmed that there's about 25,000 compiler developers and 60-something thousand brain surgeons. I had a lot of fun working with Arthur on that. And as I've said there, it's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. Some people who've read my book have said they found a bit of repetition in it. And that happens a little bit. I've tried to keep that to a minimum, but where I've left repetition of particular pieces of the story in, it's because they have slightly different perspectives. And sometimes, the creation of Sheila, for example, the Fred, Jim and Sheila, that part of the story really belongs to Chris Turner, and he tells it. But Kim Spence-Jones was there as well, and he tells it slightly differently, and in some ways perhaps better, I felt. So sometimes if there's any repetition in the stories, it's because they're bringing different colour to it, and that's together. This isn't a book that you can read half of it and know everything about the story. You really need to read the whole thing, because pieces keep getting added to it. You get someone like Brian Coburn, who starts talking about his work in Australia and then his move to the UK. And along the way, he's talking about John Cole and Joe Dunn coming out here. And then Joe talks about some of those same things, as do others. So there's different pieces, different ways of looking at the same story. And that's the essence of what this book's about. This was a question asked on Stardot. is it going to be just a rework of previously published material? Look, you can find a lot of this on the internet. In fact, it's interesting, having written the book, when I go back and read a lot of things that I had seen differently, I now see more of what the writer might have been trying to say, but either they got it wrong or they didn't give enough of a perspective on it. Being able to go back to the original sources, the 20-odd people who've contributed, plus all of the source documents that I've been able to get to, plus my own background, of course, it's been able to give more depth to it and to be more accurate. What surprised me? The Computer Literacy Project, by far. And, you know, I've got all these things buzzing through my head here, all of the inventions and the set-top boxes and YouTube and so many other things. You read the chapter by Andy Hopper, and he's talking about them inventing the iPhone before Apple did, but because of actions by AT&T, they were never able to commercialize it. But all of those amazing developments that happened following the BBC Computer Literacy Project, not to mention also the impact on the individuals and all of you people who are logged in here. None of this would have happened, or certainly not in the way it has happened, if those first steps hadn't been taken by the BBC. Does it matter what happened 40 or 50 years ago? Well, to a lot of people it doesn't, because in this last year, I've routinely asked people, do they know what an ARM chip is? And almost no one does. It almost seems like you need to be of the nerdish variety to know these things. The period I deal with is the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s. So I've got Christopher Curry nicking a bottle of ethanol Absolute from the labs at the Royal Radar establishment to top up his tank so he can go to the Cavern Club at Liverpool to see the Beatles perform. And he talks about the TSR-2 strike fighter. I worked on the F-111, which was the one that was successful. He talks about all sorts of interesting things that happened way back when. It all helps to build up an understanding of the whole story. The observations, the people that have had contribution to this, Sinclair, Science of Cambridge. Fortunately, I never had to deal with Sinclair in Australia. We distributed it, but I was able to avoid that. The Cambridge Processor Unit turned into Acorn, of course, the BBC, the University of Cambridge, and Olivetti Research Laboratories. There are a lot more organisations that get mentioned. IBM's in there, ICT, ICL, the Stanford University, and Hewlett-Packard rates are mentioned once or twice. Texas Instruments is in there. It covers a lot of the world. Some think of it as ancient history, but you know, it helps us understand how we got here. And this is another one of my favourite books. If you haven't read them, the three books that I highly recommend is The Peacemakers by Margaret Macmillan, The Soul of a New Machine, Tracy Kidder, The Ideas Factory. I can't think who the author is. This is about AT&T Bell. And then, of course, there's that runaway success, soon to be bestseller, hopefully, Voices from a Future Past. But should we care? I had quite a lot of pushback from people inside the group of contributors who couldn't see why I was going into discussing the invention of the transistor and the computer and a little bit about the UNIVAC one. I think it really is important to have some of that. Now, a lot of that I've moved to the back so that people who want to be really nerdy and just jump straight into Acorn and so on, you can do that. But there are a number of chapters, and in fact, Steve Ferber was probably my strongest advocate for putting this in, and it was quite a lot of fun to write that. As I've said, it's an international story. Much of it focuses on Cambridge and London, but technology really is international. It's driven in all parts of the world. It's this constant post-war demand for newer and better that's pushed us along. I was talking to someone recently whose daughter had been down in Africa in a village, and they wanted to know if they could borrow her charger so they could charge their mobile phones, because they had charging capabilities, solar panels, but it was too slow. Even in deepest, darkest Africa, mobile phones apparently are quite ubiquitous. And here's the difference between the US and the UK. The US post-war, they were very confident. They believed that they won the war single-handed, and every war for that matter. We weren't in Vietnam, or in the Middle East, along with the Brits. You weren't there either. It was only the US that does it all. But that confidence that they have gave them the view that they could make money everywhere. And that was what has been the engine that's driven post-war technology development, and a lot of other development for that matter. And the UK was still recovering from the Nazis and trying to get out of the economic mess that they were in. And they were very conscious of losing their position as being a preeminent leader in the world. Different drivers. So as I've said there, one driver was entrepreneurial spirit, and the other was an attempt to hold on to the formal status. So when you read a lot of the reports that led to the BBC Computer Literacy Project, they were all crafted in terms of keeping Mother England at the top of the tree as being a world power. Very different driver. I'll just quickly run through some names. I've mentioned David Allen and John Radcliffe, Richard Russell. As I've said, they're patron saint of BBC Basic. The delightful Christopher Curry, Andy Hopper. Sam Walkup was one of the managing directors after Olivetti took over. He was a great help in building the stories. Chris Turner, Steve Ferber and Sophie. So much of it I couldn't have done without those three. And then we've got Andrew Gordon, Arthur Norman, Brian Coburn, Carl Della, Jez Wills, Jim Mitchell, Joe Dunn, John Cox, John Thackeray, Kim Spence-Jones, Lawrence Hardwick, Paul Fellows, Ram Banerjee, Colin Priestley and David Bell. Oh, I've got a chapter in there, although I don't name it after myself. So those are all of those names there have a chapter in their own right, and they're cross-referenced throughout the stories. What does it cover? 60s. Chris Curry's intro to Clive and reconnecting with Herman was fairly late in the piece that I learned that there were so many stories around about how Christopher Curry and Herman Hauser met. In fact, they met as teenagers, and if you look far enough, you will actually find on the internet places where that's stated, but mostly they get it wrong. 78 to 79, this is where the Christopher at Science of Cambridge decides to build the MK14, and how that came about, and the fact that Clive had to be dragged screaming and kicking into developing computers, which is odd because he was developing calculators before it. You'd think it would have been a natural progression, but he was very much focused on building small, cheap, simple, low technology designs. And I have absolutely no doubt that Christopher Curry was the driving force to getting Sinclair to be something more than just building small electronic bits and bobs, FM radios and small amplifiers and the things that they were doing. Then Steve and Sophie come onto the scene with the fruit machine for Ace gaming down in Wales. David Allen gets sent off by Sheila, his boss's boss, She wrote the foreword for the book, by the way, on a world tour to discover technology, and came back and was very much the driver making the BBC Computer Literacy Project get off the ground. I mean, there were other people, but he was a key part of it. The 1980 was when the search for the BBC microcomputer started. You notice I've got a small m there, and it was still being called. They didn't know what it was going to be called in 1980. It wasn't until right at the end of the year, or even maybe some of the communication at the beginning of 81, that the title of it had been set. The Proton, if you go to the Melbourne Museum's website, it calls the BBC Micro number 100002. It calls it a Acorn Proton. I've had difficulty educating them that there was only ever one Proton, and it was just a prototype, and it wasn't even a complete computer. It still needed an umbilical cable to a system to operate. So that was 81 getting underway. 82, the computer program launched along with other BBC government-backed initiatives. Out here in Australia, we were shipping our first machines to the Western Australian Education Department. The massive demand created extraordinary pressures on everyone, on the BBC, on Acorn. Yeah, the Sinclair versus BBC versus Acorn is a chapter. It's a very interesting read. There you will you'll learn about the Sinclair BBC microcomputer. You can spit on the ground when you say that. It almost happened. 83, supply was continually stretched. The British electronics industry really revealed its gaping holes, its inadequacies and inability to deliver, proving absolutely how important it was that the computer literacy project happened. 83 was when they started looking at the ARM chip, and when they started on the Electron. Unfortunately, a little bit too late. 84, demand peaks, then Royal Britannia is replaced by brand loyalty. So up until then, people only wanted to buy British computers, for better or for worse. Not only, but Apple and Tandy and the others had a very small piece of the business in the UK. One of the side effects of the computer literacy project was people became more aware and better educated about computers, and it actually feeded, I think, the self-destruction of the buy British preference. Then there were the disasters, the Acorn's sudden crash into debt, oversupply. The machines that were due to arrive for the 83 Christmas didn't come until early 84, and they had to pay for them. They had to accept them. It was contracted. The Electron was obviously what I'm referring to there. And then they sunk 10 million into the USA without doing due diligence, and they spent quite a bit in Germany as well. So it was a bad time, 84. 85, Olivetti took over, and about a month or 6 weeks later, I think it was, ARM1 arrived. And by mid-year, Christopher Curry had left. And for the rest of it, you'll just have to read the book. General comments. To me, writing is a team sport, and you've probably gleaned how important the contributors and the people were more than just contributors. It wasn't that they were just giving me ideas and information. They were really helping guide and shape the story. I've always been like that as a writer. Most of my work is writing for special operations in the military or the oil industry or the power industry and so on, and very comfortable being part of a group. The production of the written word is just the collection of all the ideas and bringing them together. So the thoughts and ideas belong mainly to the contributors. Occasionally someone will say, oh, that you've added that, I didn't say that. And sometimes they remember and sometimes they don't. sometimes I do slip something in, like the Arthur Norman comment about the brain surgeons, but that's okay. But the words are mostly mine. Nevertheless, they had final approval, and there's nothing in there that people didn't want. There's no censorship. A couple of people did make some special requests. I'm not going to say what they were, but when you read the book, if you think, oh, that's odd, why did he not say this or that? It may be that the person we're talking about didn't want it in there. So I've respected their preferences. In places, it does get very raw, particularly talking about the 84-85 period and how things come off the rails. And you might find one or two people struggle with some of that and could explain why they're not in the book. It had to be honest. And in summary, this appears in David Bell's chapter. So David Bell was recruited to try to initially sort out the problems with the BBC. And he said, Acorn is what happens when there is a concentration of really clever people who happen to be in the right place at the right time and have the courage to take advantage of opportunities. They were very definitely opportunists. And Sophie said to me, I remember on one occasion, I think Steve said it as well, they were very, very lucky, both of them, to have achieved as much as they have. Sophie is very self-effacing. It's more than just luck, but they were willing to take the opportunities, and Herman had the courage, and Christopher and Andy Hopper and a few others to say, yes, we will do things that, and sometimes they got it right. As it says, they came together almost by accident. They weren't there because of their business ability, so lots of things did go wrong. The criticisms of Acorn are almost never to do with the technology. It's more to do with business decisions. Everything relied on individual motivation and a deep sense of personal responsibility. You'll see this through the book, that how people just, they talk about their sense of responsibility. I mean, Brian, who he worked for me. He was a very responsible, but nevertheless, he's a bit of a bloody anarchist, and he's proud of it. On the day he came for the job interview, the T-shirt he was wearing, like most of the T-shirts he wore, almost made it to his waist. And he wanted space in the workshop to have a pallet delivered. I was, yeah, well, I want to employ you, so yep, fine. Turned out he got a pallet of Coke delivered, and which I think people stole from him. So on one side, you've got these people who may be anarchists or a little extreme in one way or another, but on the other side, they absolutely had a great sense of personal responsibility and motivation, and they worked crazy hours and did stuff. No one tried to control them. It was an open environment. You're expected to see what needed to be done and get it done. And most of the time that worked spectacularly well. And when it failed, it was equally spectacular. So I thought that David Bell's comments was a good conclusion to it. Now, I'm going to draw breath and let Brian take over.
Thank you very much, Rob. I do love that last quote from David Bell. I think that does, I think probably many people's minds sums up the kind of what Acorn were like.
I couldn't have done better.
Right. Robert Small, do you want to ask your question, or shall I read it out?
Yeah, I can ask it myself. So my question's really about how the people in the book see their place in history. So, do the people involved feel that the folk history and the mythology that's grown up around Acorn fairly reflects their own roles within it? And I have a particular example in mind, which is Jim Mitchell and the ARC's operating system, and how that relates to the origins of RISC-OS in the mid-80s.
Well, you picked an interesting example with Jim. He does feature, obviously, a chapter in there, and as does Carl Deller, because Carl was the his two eyes see, after getting a fairly scathing review of ARCS by Paul, I think it was, Paul Fellows. Paul was fairly critical of a few things that happened in that era, and he made some very negative comments about the Acorn Research Centre and ARCS, and I sent the chapter initially to Carl Della, and he cringed a little bit and said, I think, you know, he actually sent it down to Jim and suggested that Jim talk to me. So we had a really good talk. We're around about the same vintage. I mean, he's far more famous than I, but I worked for Grace Hopper, so I'm about that sort of. I was very young, admittedly, but I was going around the same era. So we've got a lot of similar stories and the ability to be have a perspective that's balanced. He is very generous. He didn't throw himself on his sword, but he was very willing to say that if he had it all over again, he would have done it differently. So I think that this is what I was saying earlier about how different people offer slightly different perspectives about the same piece. I've tried to draw that out. Where there was potential for conflict, I've done that. I was questioning, is Richard Russell with us today, Brian?
Yes.
He certainly was, yes.
Is he still with us?
Or has he wandered off to make a cup of tea?
Richard...
He's still in the list. He's still there.
Richard and I had a lot of discussion about object-oriented programming after I'd written the chapter on BBC Basic. And I wrote some negatives about object-oriented programming as an... Good morning, Richard. Good to see you. We have quite different perspectives on a number of things, and we have some quite solid debates, a lot of respect. And in the final analysis, when after getting Chris Jarrett's input on it and talking to other people, I basically ended up going with Richard's position. In other words, I softened my view a little bit and I took things simply out of the book because we couldn't come to an agreement. There were some strong differing views, and it wasn't a book that deserved a great debate about it. So sometimes that's what I ended up doing. In the case of Jim, I was not expecting him to be as willing to say, no, they're right, we did it, it was a mistake, we shouldn't have opened up in Palo Alto, we should have been in Cambridge. That's all part of the story.
Yeah, interesting. It's fascinating to hear about because you know, the victors get to write the history, right? So it's always interesting to hear the kind of opposing view and different viewpoints from people who were actually there at the time, rather than just reading kind of third-hand stuff on the internet.
Look, I confess to having made the changes on Wikipedia to some of the Acorn material, because if you go back 15 years ago, whenever I made those changes, one would think that everything that ever happened with the BBC and Acorn happened in Cambridge. Well, it just didn't. John Cole and I wrote most of the BBC user guide, and even David Allen, who was the editor, didn't know how much I was doing on it. It was never, to me, it was never about trying to claim glory or anything like that. There were people there in Britain who didn't attend, who were not invited to attend major events over the decades. They didn't get the credit they deserved. This was always going to be a book about giving people credit. And I know with some people, it took a lot of work to convince them that I was absolutely genuine about my determination to give them the credit they deserved.
Thank you.
Can Jock come online and his last question and perhaps just speak to camera?
Yeah, sure, Rob. What did you want me to say?
What were you saying about it? Seems to be all about hardware and not software. Is that what you're saying?
No. Saying hardware, software, and the people who made it happen. So the background there is Pixel, which was published a book semi-recently in the last 5 years or so, was all about the gaming on the Acorn platform, which appealed to a certain segment of the audience, which, okay, we might have dabbled in a couple of games here and there, but your background story of the inner workings and the development and the various aspects of who contributed to what is super interesting. So,
thank you. Kind to say it. I drive friends and family crazy when we're sitting around having a discussion about almost anything for the last several months. It's hard to have a conversation where something about virtually any topic doesn't go, oh yeah, I talk about that in my book. And we're not talking about computers and technology. We're talking about every damn thing. This stuff has so pervaded our lives. You read it, and this is a bit like The Peacemakers, that Margaret Macmillan book. Once you've read that, you can't unread it. It is, you become aware of what happened in the 20th century politically, how Iran and Iraq was spawned out of Mesopotamia, why New Guinea, German New Guinea, became part of a territory of Australia, and so on and so on and so on. It's similar in that's the best way to explain it, that you'll see in this book. And look, I'm not here to plug my book. I'm here to really plug the people who contributed to it and those stories. You will see that all the way through it. There's things that will come up that aren't just fitting within the boundaries of Acorn and the BBC microcomputer and RISCOS and so on. It goes way beyond that. You'll be seeing impacts on national economics, technology, chip development, software development. That's all the technology side, but you'll also see how it pops up in other aspects of life. That's what I found so fascinating about doing this.
Is there anything you were trying to establish or uncover or prove that you weren't able to, that proved to be elusive?
Not being able to get to Glyn Phillips was a great disappointment. There were a couple of people that I really would have liked to have been able to. I would have loved to be able to talk to John Cole, obviously. The contribution from people like John Cole and the way we worked together was such a big part of this project. Now, I don't know whether I answered the original question. I've wandered off it, haven't I?
Well, it was just, as you say, people have different recollections. Was there anything that you couldn't resolve one way or the other?
Couldn't resolve.
Or have you just reported both versions and it's up to the audience?
I'm trying to think whether there was. Look, there were things that were very, very difficult to get to a conclusion on. One of them was, and I spent a lot of time, there was a huge number of emails, went backwards and forwards on this, was the date when the decision when they worked out who had come to see the proton and how was the decision made, there were suggestions that maybe John Cole had been too close to Acorn and that he had applied undue influence on the decision. In fact, the reverse is true. Up until just before the final meeting, John was saying, no, we can't go with Acorn. So there was disabusing things like that. And it was the 6th of February. Finding out the date was really, really difficult. And then right at the very end, one of the people who went to that meeting was a guy called Dr. Mel Pullen, who's famous in the UK for his nuclear disarmament work. He has the most extraordinary diary, and he was able to send me a list of all of the BBC meetings he had over that period, including when they went there. So I think in the final wash-up, we resolved everything that was difficult. Getting all of the correspondence from Richard Russell and being able to go through that was really important.
One of your comments you made a few minutes ago, you said about John Cole was saying that, oh, we shouldn't go with Acorn for the BBC Micro. Why was he still saying, although we shouldn't go for Acorn then? Or was he because he felt he was influenced and had to be contrary?
No. This was before there is the end of 80 and the beginning of 81. There's a chapter there where I give dates and brief statements about correspondence and what's happened. And some people have read it and have said, why do you have all this? This is unnecessary. It's too much detail, all these dates. But in fact, for those of us that want to understand what happened in that period, you really do need to look at, okay, on this date, John Cole writing a report about New Brain, which he then a couple of days later sends a copy to the managing director of Newbury Laboratories, and who a month or so later writes back to John Radcliffe, commenting on John's report. So John's critical pretty much of everyone, quite rightly so. The simple fact is, as I've written my analysis, and I don't tend to write a lot of personal commentary, but the question obviously needs to be asked: if you were going to be designing and building a computer, and you're going to be within a 2 or 3 year period making and selling 1 million of them, would you go to a little company off the Market Square in Cambridge, upstairs behind the local electrical showroom, and get them to design and build 1 million computers for you?
But did they know at the time they were going to sell 1 million? Surely at the time they thought they were going to sell a few thousand.
They thought they were talking about 20,000, and if it was less than 12,000, Acorn could renegotiate the deal. And they'd already built 12,000 atoms. The reason John Cole wasn't keen on Acorn was because he was talking about the atom. I got involved in all of this in the first place in the Easter of 81. So just after Acorn started on the BBC development, by writing a 5-page report describing, are there any atom lovers in your group? 5 pages slamming the atom as being a load of rubbish.
Speaking of robustness, I had a business in the late 80s which had dozens of BBC Master ETs on an Econet network. And one day the window cleaners came in, and one of them stood on one end of a very long desk, and there was a BBC Master on the other end, and it acted like a seesaw. And it launched the BBC Master and its monitor through the air over the top of the window cleaner. trailing its cables, and it smashed onto the floor. And we went in there and picked it up, plugged it back in, and it was fine.
Well, there is the story of, I think it might be Steve Ferber. If it wasn't Steve, it might have been one of the guys anyway. They spilt coffee on a weekend. They were in there by themselves, and they'd spilt tea or coffee in their BBC Micro, and it through the breakers, and eventually found the breaker and powered it back up and dried out the computer and turned it back on, not expecting it to work. Actually, it might have been John Thackeray, now I think about it. John's chapter is very entertaining. He did, he came out to Australia on a court case, and he talks about his wanderings around. Very interesting, very entertaining. For those of us who understand and know some of these people, and have an interest in the business and the technology and all that, it's a fantastic read. What I'm hoping is that I've been able to put enough into it for people who aren't in that inner circle. Stuart. I just saw Stuart Swale's comment. Yeah, I'm hoping that people who aren't aficionados will also find it entertaining. The drop test will be if you give the book to your wife, and your wife enjoys the read, then I'll have succeeded. I'm going to have to start thinking about winding it up. I'm conscious of the fact that it's very late over there. You guys must be
Yes.
on drugs.
You aren't keeping us up. We're usually up all night.
It's only 10 to 10.
Yeah, well,
But you had an early start, didn't you, Rob?
I had an early start, and I probably need to think about getting moving on. So, are there any other questions?
It's your last chance.
Time to go, I think. 4:45 here anyway in Perth, so it's time for me to go back to bed for a couple of hours before I go to the gym. See you later, boys.
Bye. Right, well, so I'll just finish then by saying thank you very much, Rob. That was all fascinating. And I think, as it's been said in the chat lots of times, I think we're looking forward to seeing the book.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm more of a writer than a talker.
Well.
So I don't know how much of that needs to be trimmed if you're really going to circulate it anywhere.
I will have a look whether we'll edit it to just the talk part and leave off the questions or something. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. All right. Hopefully I didn't slander anyone.
No, I don't think so.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Rob. It's been a pleasure.
You've been very generous with your time. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much indeed.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Good night.